Palestinian health officials say at least 10 people, including children, have been killed in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza City. The strike hit a former school in the Al Tufa neighbourhood that's being used as a shelter for displaced people.
The IDF claims it carried out a precise strike against targets in the school, successfully killing a Hamas commander. It also says it's aware of reports that several civilians were killed in the strike.
Meanwhile, thousands of protesters continue to gather in central Tel Aviv, calling on the Israeli government to do more to secure the release of hostages held in Gaza. Mass protests have been renewed in the past 2 weeks after the bodies of 6 hostages were recovered. Families of the hostages have expressed frustration over the government's failed negotiations to bring them home.
Our hostages are still suffocating in there because of him. As long as Netanyahu is in power, this war will go on indefinitely, and there will be no hostage deal. To save the hostages' lives, Netanyahu must be replaced.
Hundreds of people have gathered in the Turkish coastal city of Didim for the funeral of a Turkish-American activist killed in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Ayşenur Aygi was killed last week while she took part in a protest against settlement expansion in the West Bank. Israel has acknowledged that its troops shot the activist, but says it was an unintentional act during a demonstration that turned violent. The country's vice president and foreign minister were among other dignitaries who paid their respects.
Earlier, I spoke to Alexandra Saieh, who's the head of humanitarian policy and advocacy at Save the Children.
The situation in Gaza is as grim as ever. We are seeing almost weekly attacks on schools that have turned into shelters for families that have absolutely nowhere else to go. And these latest attacks have occurred on locations where, families were crowded into a school, crowded into one place because their homes have been destroyed. They have absolutely nowhere else to go. And we're seeing these attacks almost every single week. We're even seeing earlier this week, we saw an attack on an area called the Israeli designated Humanitarian zone. This is an area where families were told to go to, and they're crammed into tents. It's a very overcrowded, and what we're seeing and what we've seen this past week are just absolutely devastating images of families displaced, children killed. It's absolutely horrifying.
The attack on the school you mentioned earlier this week, 6 staffers from UNRWA were among those killed in the airstrikes. Tell us what communication takes place between the IDF and organisations like that. What is the coordination to avoid aid workers being killed in these attacks?
So humanitarian organizations like Save the Children and also the UN, including UNRWA, they notify the Israeli authorities where they are delivering assistance, where they're located, and every single time that they move. And so it's just shocking and horrifying that even when the UN notifies the Israeli authorities about where they're located, we still see aid workers killed. Save the Children has also had a staff member killed. Almost every single organization in Gaza has had staff members killed in the line of duty, delivering life-saving assistance. And, Gaza has become the most dangerous place for an aid worker. More than 280 aid workers have been killed since the start of this crisis back in October 2023. It's the highest that we've seen in a single year compared to any other conflict in the world.
This school overnight and the one attacked earlier this week, as you say, were being used to shelter displaced people. The Israeli military says that it was targeting Hamas militants. What do you make of that response from Israel?
Look, what we know is that families were affected, that children have been killed, that women were sheltering there with their children. And we're seeing this again and again and again. And there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. In addition to these devastating attacks by the Israeli forces, we are continuing to see aid obstructed, prevented from coming into Gaza. And as a result, even when there are these attacks, the remaining medical facilities that exist in Gaza do not have the capacity to treat these massive trauma cases. Save the Children, my organization, we've been waiting for months to get medical supplies into Gaza, and they have been prevented from entering because the types of trucks that are needed, closed trucks with cold storage, are not allowed by the Israeli authorities. We've tried various ways, and they have still been prevented. And so this is the situation in Gaza. This is why we are seeing the situation only getting worse. And it's enough. It needs to stop. We need a ceasefire. We needed it months ago. And this is what we continue to call for as aid organizations.
Alexandra, just finally, also this week we had a UN report show that Gaza's economy has shrunk to less than a sixth of its size since the Israel-Hamas war began almost a year ago. Also that unemployment in the occupied West Bank has nearly tripled. Give us a sense of the human impact of that. Can you paint us a picture of what that means in the day-to-day lives of the people there?
The ability for Palestinians in Gaza to survive has been completely depleted. There are no jobs. There is barely any food. There are barely any medical supplies. I mean, it's just horrific. I can tell you a story that my colleague told me just last week. We have a clinic in Gaza, and we had a young mother come in visibly malnourished, and her children, her 4 children, the fourth one she just gave birth to, also visibly malnourished. And this is the human cost of what's happening in Gaza. Even if there was a ceasefire tomorrow, life would not be able to get back to normal. Virtually every single school has been either destroyed or is being used to shelter civilians. Almost more than 70% of the infrastructure of the homes have been decimated. People are living in tents and overcrowded camps with no clean water. It's going to take years for life to get back to any semblance of normality.
Alexandra Saieh, Head of Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy at Save the Children, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.